that things can happen, and frequently do, to people as brainy and footsie as you.
Last night around 8:30 p.m, I went out to the edge of the woods on my property to set up a blind to shoot some nuisance coyotes that have been eating my chickens. I live in New Hampshire, at an area where people who live near these woods commonly refer to a phenomena known as bad nights. It's an eerie feeling where you don't want to be anywhere near a door or window when it gets dark, and you certainly don't want to be outside. Animal life seems to be affected as well, since it's always eerily quiet on those nights. Thankfully, it was a good night, so I thought I'd be fine. I set up with a long-range modified handgun, a mounted night vision scope with a thermal setting, and a high-end night vision handheld. Both pieces of equipment have a high four-figure price range. I set up facing the woods, and for most of the night I saw nothing, coyote or otherwise. A little before 10:30, I was scanning the field just before the tree line with my thermal scope when I saw a red orb pop up. It was about 4 feet off the ground, not moving. The thermal was giving a reading of 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which made no sense, considering it was around 40 degrees Fahrenheit that night. Also, the scope is very high definition. I can see small birds at 50 yards away, and they show up perfectly bird-shaped. There's no reason anything should look round. It also had a strange, low-quality, staticky look to it, which AIs made no sense considering it was well within my 50-yard marker at the tree line. When I went to switch to night vision mode, it disappeared. I never saw anything else like it for the rest of the night. Later on, around 11, my handheld night vision scope started malfunctioning. The brightness and exposure was fluctuating wildly for no reason, and it was randomly turning on and off. I chalked it up to the battery being dead or dying, and stopped using it. But this afternoon, when I started to get my equipment ready again, it was working perfectly normally. It's the same temperature again today, 40 degrees Fahrenheit, so it's not temperature related. The final weird thing was that around midnight, right as I was packing up to head inside, after having no luck with my coyote problem, as my gun jammed and the animals ran off, I heard a voice laughing. It sounded echoey, and due to being on a hill and there being lots of trees, I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. I thought it was my neighbor who lives on the other side of the field. Note, the house was not in the direction I was firing towards, just so no one comes for me about gun safety. The house was 200 feet behind me and to the left. This morning, the neighbor was talking to me about how my hunt went, and I joked with her that she should know considering she laughed after I missed my shot. She was confused, and I said I heard laughing and assumed it was from her house. She said no one in the house was outside or even awake at that time of night. So, what do y'all think? Forest ghost? Messing with my equipment and laughing at me? Or just equipment malfunctions? I'm going out again tonight, and I'll try to record if anything like that happens again. Yesterday, I, 25 female, decided to go for a quick solo hike, 40 minutes to the peak, in rural New Hampshire, to pick blueberries at the top. I've done this hike by myself several times before, 30 plus times actually, and have only felt unsafe one other time when I encountered some coyotes. This time was different. Yesterday was a foggy, misty day, which I thought would be a great day to hike since it wasn't hot. I pulled into the parking lot around 3 p.m. and nobody else was there. I started off my hike by listening to music on my phone. The trail was a bit muddy, but all was well. About halfway up, the trees became shrouded with mist, which is normal when elevation is increasing. The second half of the way up, I felt uneasy but ignored it and continued listening to my music. I reached the peak. I was the only one up there, and began picking blueberries. About 15 minutes into the picking, I began to faintly hear a group of children talking and laughing. I grabbed my stuff and brought it closer to me, preparing to give the other group coming up some more space. They were far away enough where I couldn't make out anything they were saying, but I could faintly hear them shrieking and laughing. After about another 15 minutes, the group still hadn't reached the peak, and I remember thinking it was odd that I could hear them for that long and they still hadn't arrived. Mind you, this mountain only has one trail leading to the peak. After a few more minutes, the realization hit me that it almost sounded like a recording. I stopped picking berries and listened. Every 30 seconds or so, the same laughs, shrieks, and voices would loop. At this point, I began to feel very uneasy and packed up my things to leave. On the way down, I had a feeling that I shouldn't listen to music, to be more aware of my surroundings. I pulled out a small switchblade and held it in my hand, just to feel a little more safe. At this point, it was around 5 p.m. and it was getting darker. Mist was still shrouding the top of the mountain and visibility wasn't great. I was half expecting to pass a group of kids, but never did. In fact, it was chillingly silent. The laughing and shrieking had completely disappeared. I felt extremely unsettled and like something off the trails was watching me, and began to see bizarre, unexplainable things deep into the sides of the trail. Dark figures, strange faces, etc. The thing that has been etched into my mind and inspired me to share this story was maybe 50 to 75 feet off the trail to my right. I can only describe it as 4 perfect cylinders, round, smooth, brown, that resembled legs, going far enough up into the saplings that I couldn't see a body attached to them. Whatever it was appeared to be facing me, and must have been at least 10 to 12 feet tall. I only got a glimpse of it, and by the time it registered to me that I was looking at something strange, it was gone. I picked up my pace and kept my eyes on the ground below my feet. 20 minutes to go. Just as I was reaching the point where the mist was fading, I heard an ear-piercing screech. The only thing I can compare it to is a dog whistle that lasted 5 to 10 seconds, then silence again. My heart was racing, but the only thing I could do was keep moving towards my car. Once I got below the mist line, the uneasy feeling let up a bit and didn't experience anything else after the screech. Has anybody heard of anything like this happening, or has anybody experienced anything like this? I can't stop thinking about it. I don't think I'll be hiking there alone again anytime soon. In the summer of 2013, I was hiking the Camino de Santiago in northern Spain, and I saw something I will never forget. I don't know how much of it was real because I was cold, hungry, thirsty, exhausted and sick when I saw it. But good Lord, it scared me. I was on the Camino Primitivo, the oldest section of the Camino. It's also the least well-traveled. I'd go there days without seeing anyone else on the road. There is a stretch about 20 kilometers through the mountains called Los Hospitales because there are some ruins of medieval hospitals along the path in the heights. It's supposed to be the best view on the whole 200 kilometers of Primitivo, so I really wanted to see it. It's a long story, but I'll try to leave out the less important bits. I didn't mean to be in such a bad shape that day. There's a small shelter a few clicks before the mountains, so I planned to stop there the night before and then continue. As I neared the shelter, someone had scrawled a message on the wall, warning not to stay there because the hospitalero, as the guys who take care of the places are called, is a thief. At the previous town, there had been a sign that said there was no hospitalero at this shelter, so of course I was suspicious. Sure enough, when I arrived, there was an unwashed old man cooking a can of beans over a fire outside of the shelter who asked me for money to stay. I decided that I didn't trust him, so I just got my stamp proving I had gone through that village and pressed on. So I started the Los Hospitales stage after already walking almost a full day's walk. The villages were too small to have grocery stores or even restaurants, so I had no food or water other than what little was in my pack. I was getting over a cold as well, and although it wasn't bad at this point, it started to bother me more as I fatigued. As I started to climb the mountain, I passed a sign that read, "Peligro, osos," danger, bears. But at this point I was committed, so I kept going. When I got near the top of the mountains, the weather changed. It was so foggy that I couldn't see more than a few meters in front of me. When I looked over the edge of the path, it was straight down into a foggy abyss. It was also cold. It was well into June, but the high was in the 50s, and the mist only made it worse for a guy wearing only shorts and a tank top. When I got on the plane, I had no idea what the weather would be like, and I foolishly imagined northern Spain to be a Mediterranean climate. The only vegetation was the short grass and some sparse moss. Other than that, the landscape was just small rocks. Somehow there were cattle grazing up there, and horses. I don't know how they survived on such little food. I walked for several hours until I came to the ruins. At this point, I decided to try to camp out in the stones. I put a tarp up next to the stone wall, but the mist was so thick that it penetrated the tarp, my poncho, my astronaut blanket, everything. I was freezing. I was cold before, but when I stopped moving, I immediately started shivering wildly. I decided that despite my fatigue, I'd continue. Hell, if I didn't, I was going to freeze to death up there. The path alternated between the top of the ridge and the side of the mountain. I would have to occasionally climb down from the path holding onto shrubs. It was really steep. To avoid the huge steers with horns longer than my arm span, and their calves blocking the way, I'd run out of water and food. The food made me sick to my stomach anyway, and I had no idea how far I had gone through the mist or how much farther I had to go. Then, on a stretch along the flat top of the mountain dotted with otherworldly pools of mist and rainfall, I saw it. A herd of horses came galloping past me without warning. And when I turned around, there was the biggest steer I'd ever seen. It was walking slowly towards me in the direction the horses had gone. As it approached, I noticed that it was getting taller, not larger, but its legs appeared to be elongating. At this point, it was still a more or less faint outline in the mist, but when it was very close, less than 10 meters, I could see it clearly. The body was more or less normal, but the legs were almost 2 meters long and rail thin. The thing towered over me, but the abnormal proportions weren't the only strange thing about it. This steer had fangs, an entire mouthful of long, jagged, yellow, sharp fangs. When it opened its mouth and revealed them, I ran. I don't know how far it was, but I didn't stop until I reached a highway at the far end of the mountain and heard the humming of a telephone line at last. I saw some other creepy stuff that day as I made my way to the next habitable place, most notably a ruined town with a population of one old Asturian man and his huge dog. But after the demon steer, nothing bothered me too much. I made it to the next small town that had a hostel so late that everything was closed, and I had to sleep outside in the 20-degree Fahrenheit weather. I really want to blame what I saw on my questionable physical and mental state at the time. I walked 48 kilometers that day, according to the guidebook, about 13 hours in all. But I can't forget what some of the older locals had told me about avoiding the areas around dolmens, prehistoric burial stones in the mountains. As far as I know, there isn't a dolmen in Los Hospitales, but the people living there have legends of strange remnants from the area's Celtic past living on. in the mountains. And I saw something that makes me wonder if they aren't just legends. I used to work on the north slope of Alaska in the oil industry. The work we were doing required us to travel far out into the Alaska Petroleum Reserve, which is basically just untamed tundra wilderness for hundreds of miles. The oil companies would build these long ice roads in the winter that would lead to exploration drilling pads. Our job was to go out after they finished the initial drilling and test rock formations for their oil-producing qualities. It was mid-January. The sun hadn't quite come up yet. And when I say the sun hadn't come up, I mean in almost a month and a half. Polar nights are intense. The particular well site we were traveling to was about 60 miles west of Alpine, Alaska, deep in the wilderness. Our job took a week, but we finished and were headed back to camp to finish our hitch and go home. At the beginning and end of the ice roads are guard shacks that you have to check in and out of for safety. No cell reception, and radios work only up to a distance. If you don't check in or out in a set time, they come looking for you to ensure you're not a popsicle. It was about 4 a.m. Not that it mattered in the land of endless night, and we were halfway across the ice road. Travel was slow, as the speed limit on the roads is only 25 miles per hour, when something appeared on the road in our headlights. It was a man, in jeans, sneakers and a hoodie jacket, walking down an ice road in wilderness tundra at 4 a.m. and it was minus 20 degrees outside. It's not unusual for the local Inuit people to be out this far hunting. Maybe his snowmobile broke down and he's trying to get back to the guard shack. Seemed plausible. He didn't acknowledge us as our trucks rolled up next to him. He just kept shuffling forward. He didn't seem cold. His clothing, while totally not appropriate for this extreme weather, appeared warm and dry. We also noticed he wasn't Inuit, but Caucasian. I rolled down my window and asked if he needed any help, and if he was okay. He still didn't acknowledge us, just kept shuffling forward. His face was completely blank, devoid of any thought or emotions. The other guys in my truck suggested that maybe he was in an accident and in shock. I continued rolling my truck alongside him as he trudged down the road, still trying to get his attention. Even in this extreme cold, I could occasionally get whiffs of a peculiar smell coming off him. He smelled acidic, if that makes sense. There was just a lot about this guy that made the hair on my neck stand up. The guy behind me in the truck's crew cab had had enough of all this. He rolled down his window and reached out to grab the guy. He later said he was just going to try and shake him out of his stupor. Before my buddy's hand could reach him though, this walking popsicle spun around and latched onto my buddy's outstretched arm. He glared at my buddy, and then at me with this look of pure rage, not removing his hand from his arm. If emotions had a physical temperature, this guy could have melted the entire tundra that night. My buddy groaned in pain as he tried to get his arm free from Mr. Popsicle. At that moment, this guy starts screaming in our faces. There was so much hate and rage and anger in that scream. It was absolutely terrifying. I slammed on the gas and spun out on the ice for a second before the wheels caught and launched us forward. Popsicle Dude still had a hold on my buddy's arm and was trying to pull him out of the truck. He was running alongside the truck while the other guys in the cab held onto my buddy to keep him inside. After several moments, it could have only been a few seconds at most, my buddy tore free from this guy and we hauled ass to the guard shack, another 30 miles down the road. We checked in with the guards and reported what we had just seen. The guard was looking at us like we were pulling a prank, but policy said they had to check it out regardless. My buddy's arm was sore, and when he pulled back his sleeve, there were noticeable bruises in the shape of a hand around his arm. We filed a report with the guard, and we're told to head back to our camp. None of us really wanted to talk about what happened, and it was a quiet drive the rest of the way. We flew home the next day. The next time we saw the guard at the shack, we asked him if they ever saw Mr. Popsicle on his patrols. He told us they searched up and down that ice road for a solid 12-hour shift and saw nothing, not even tracks in the snow leading off the road. He told us it was a good prank and that he'd get us back for making him waste a shift driving around. But it wasn't a prank. Who would make up a story like that? And who would willingly bruise their arm for a dumb prank? We never got a satisfying answer to what happened that evening. I still wonder about that dude, if he even was a dude. The Alaskan tundra is a weird place. This is a personal story that happened to me a few years ago when I was 26. I've been too scared to talk about it until now, out of fear of being made fun of. So here is my story. Call me Sarah. 4 years ago, my great-grandmother passed away at the age of 98. We were close all the way into my adult years, so the death hit me hard. She lived in a one-story house in a rural town 30 minutes outside of Springfield, Missouri. Her house sat on a large and heavily forested piece of land. There was a large hill several feet behind the house that dropped off into a creek. I spent my entire childhood staying on this piece of land and had learned how to take care of it and the house. After the funeral services, I volunteered to stay and take care of the land while my family decided on what to do with it. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to buy the land, so I wanted to spend as much time out there as I could. My first 3 days I spent packing up items and cleaning the house. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, so I didn't have to worry about unwanted guests that would get in the way of my packing and disturb my personal way of mourning the loss of someone so close to me. The 4th day is when the odd events started occurring. I slept in a sleeping bag in the living room, and when I woke up, I immediately screamed. A few inches away from my face was a dead copperhead snake. It was normal for snakes and other small animals to get into the house, so seeing the snake wasn't surprising. It was the fact that it was so close to my face and it could have bitten me at any moment while I was sleeping. I briefly wondered why the snake had just come in the house and died because there were no physical signs that anything was wrong with it. So I threw it outside and continued with my day, and the weird event was almost forgotten. Later that evening, I decided to go for a walk through the woods to enjoy the nice weather and reminisce about the good times I'd had in the woods and all the games we used to play. I was walking along an old path that led to a well. The path was narrow and was close to the drop-off that led to the creek. I heard a branch snap behind me and instinctively turned my head. I didn't see anything, so I assumed it was an animal and continued walking. Just a few minutes later, I heard a snap to my left and turned to look again, but I still didn't see anything. I started to worry that I was being stalked by something, but it was rare to see large animals in this area, so I continued walking. I heard a 3rd snap directly in front of me, but now instead of being worried, I was upset. I was convinced that someone else was out here trying to scare me, so I shouted at what I assumed to be a person, "Go away!" And everything went uncomfortably silent. I started to hear footsteps approaching in front of me, but I couldn't see anything. They got faster and faster until whoever or whatever it was running right at me. I covered my face with my arms and waited to be attacked by some invisible person, but the footsteps stopped. I slowly lowered my arms, but instead of seeing a person, a bobcat, or even a bear, I saw a gigantic spider in the middle of a web I hadn't noticed before. If I would have taken one more step, I would have ended up being bitten. I turned and ran as fast as I could through the overgrowth and back to the house. I was spooked, but I was out in the middle of the woods, and sometimes things like this happened. I knew this land and the house well, So I pushed through the night, and the next 2 days, nothing out of the ordinary happened. I started yard work my second week staying at the house, and it wasn't bad. I'd actually found some old trinkets from my childhood that I'd buried under a tree. While I was picking up fallen branches from a storm that previous night, I noticed a clump of hair was caught in one of them. I remember its color being brown and black and considered the possibility of it being a rare encounter with a bear. But there were no tracks that I could see. I brushed it off again, but I was starting to think that maybe someone else was staying on the property, and that upset me. I decided to stay up late and see if I could catch the person in the act. Nothing happened until around 2 a.m. I remember everything so vividly because of how terrified I was. It started with branches crunching and the sound of the wheelbarrow I'd been using earlier falling over. I readied my flashlight and a small knife just in case whoever it was got violent. I heard them step onto the front porch and pull at the screen door, but they quickly abandoned it and instead started walking around the house. I could hear them scraping something sharp against the house, and I was furious. I stood up and shined my flashlight at the nearest window that I assumed the person was standing near and shouted at them, "I have a weapon, get off this property now." Everything stopped and I was positive that whoever it was had left, until I heard something slam against the window, so hard I was surprised it didn't break. My flashlight shined on the person, and at first I wasn't sure what I was looking at. It had long, dark hair with eyes that were way too big for its face. Its skin was wrinkled and reminded me of a naked mole rat. It pressed its face against the glass and fogged it up with its breath. I heard it run around the house several times and bang on every wall, window, and the door every time it passed them. This went on for hours and I was too scared to move or do anything. I was completely alone, being tormented by some strange monster. Every now and then, I would get the courage to shine my flashlight and caught a glimpse of the thing. Each time I saw it, it looked more animal-like. All I could do was cry and wait for it to go away. Finally, just after sunrise, the running and banging stopped. But I didn't dare move until well after 9 a.m. It took all my courage to open the front door and see what damage had been done to the house and yard after the terrifying experience from the night before. But there was nothing. No footprints, no scratches against the house or broken or cracked windows. It was almost like I'd imagined the whole thing, but I knew what I saw and had experienced was real. Nothing else happened for the rest of my stay there, and by the end of the month my grandfather came to pick me up and take care of the belongings I'd packed away. I was still terrified by what had happened, but I had almost convinced myself that I'd imagined it until my grandfather spoke to me. He told me that he was happy that this land was being sold and how much he hated growing up here. When I asked him why, his answer seemed to validate my experience. Now, my grandfather is a serious, no-nonsense man. He was the type of person that stayed quiet, but when he did speak, you'd better listen because it was important. He was a hardened war veteran and devoted Christian, so things like paranormal and supernatural were just fairy tales to him. He made sure to tell his children and me and the rest of my siblings and cousins that. He told me how his mother, my great-grandmother, would always try to scare him and his sister with stories about the land being guarded by monsters. The story says that these monsters, hybrids is what we call them, were the children of falsely accused witches. The people living in the area back when this was going on claimed that the children were part witch and part animal and needed to be killed. So they were left in the forest to die. He said that when the witch children died, they came back as spirits and claimed the woods as their own, and any unwelcome visitors would be tortured until they were literally scared to death. Just how their falsely accused mothers had been scared when they had been killed. My grandfather said he didn't believe in much outside of his religion, but he believed that the hybrids were real, and that he had been tormented by one when he tried to go hunting in the woods for the first time and shot his first deer. He believed he had upset the hybrids by killing an innocent animal and never stepped foot on the land with a weapon, and they finally left him alone. Maybe it is a foolish thing to believe, but I believe that the story my grandfather told me is true, simply because we both had similar terrifying experiences. If I had had a camera, I would have tried to take a picture of the creature, or if I could draw, I would post a picture of the drawing. I remember every detail about what I saw, and will be burned into my memory forever. All of my childhood memories seem tainted now because of this experience, and now I don't think I'm going to miss the land as much as I first thought. It didn't take long for the land and the house to be sold. The hybrids, or whatever is out there, can be somebody else's nightmare. One night was more than enough for me. Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. As always, a big thank you to all of the Reddit users who kindly allowed me to use their stories. If you want to help support this channel, you will find links to both my Patreon and my Teespring store in the description below, so feel free to have a look. And the biggest thank you to all of you who continue to support me. I truly do appreciate it. And remember,
Papa loves you.